much, David. And good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everyone. And a warm welcome to our distinguished panelists and speakers, and to everyone taking the time to participate in this event. Just a few practical remarks to start us off. Translation into Spanish, English, and Russian is available. You just need to click on the globe and select which language you prefer. Please also introduce yourself in the chat and post any questions you may have to the panel in the Q&A box, as we will have some time for discussions later on in the session. My name is Signe Lett. I'm a senior advisor at the International Work Group for Indigenous Affairs, or IFGIA, and I will be moderating this event today. The event is co-organized with Indigenous Peoples' Rights International, Observatorio Ciudadano, and INFOE. IFGIA has been involved in the issue of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights since the adoption of the principles. IFGIA has supported the effective participation of Indigenous peoples in the meetings of the Working Group on Business and Human Rights, as well as the UN Forum on Business and Human Rights. IFGIA has also supported local Indigenous organizations in understanding and using the principles to ensure their rights at the local level. In 2014, IFGIA published a report entitled Business and Human Rights, Interpreting the UN Guiding Principles for Indigenous Peoples, with the aim to raise awareness and understanding among Indigenous peoples themselves on the guiding principles and the relevance to them. I'm therefore very pleased that today we will officially be launching the publication called The UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and Indigenous Peoples, Progress Achieved, the Implementation Gap, and the Challenges for the Next Decade, written by the same two committed authors who wrote the first report. They've tirelessly been working in this field, and we will be speaking with them later in today's event, Johannes Rohr and Jose Alvin. But before we turn to that conversation, I'm very honored to present Mr. Dante Pesce for the opening remarks. Mr. Dante Pesce is the chair of the Working Group on the issue of human rights and transnational corporations and other business enterprises. He's also the founder and executive director of the Vincula Center for Social Responsibility and Sustainable Development at the Catholic University in Chile. And this organization is working in 14 Latin American countries in outreach, capacity building, and advisory services related to sustainability and responsible business practices. Mr. Pesce is also a special advisor on public policy to the UN Global Compact and a member of the Stakeholder Council to the Global Reporting Initiative. Welcome, Mr. Pesce. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Greetings from Geneva, where we are after 15 months in session of the working group. So it's the first week that we actually see our faces in so long months. So there's a little bit of a feeling of normality somehow, despite having empty rooms, but at least the meetings are happening. I was chair of the working group until yesterday. As you probably know, we rotate the 5 members of the working group. So starting today is actually Surya, but since he's not here in Geneva, I let's say roll over and remain acting chair for today and tomorrow. But so minor detail. Let me get into the specific, let's say, topic of our conversation. We planned with 2.5 years of advance the evaluation of the first 10 years of the implementation of the guiding principles on business and human rights. We look after political support, let's say the German government, Switzerland, Sweden, and some others, the European Union. And we did fundraising in order to have some additional funding to be able to put together a robust process of consultation, of listening. And we did that for a year, and you were part of that. And this report that you're presenting is actually one of the products of that process, in which we got more than 200 written submissions from global indigenous people like you, global unions, global business, and more than 200 reports, many from governments, coalitions of different kinds, etc. And we organize more than 30 ad hoc consultations, and we were invited to more than 40 or almost 50 consultations that took place, including the ones organized by you, in order to listen. And what we said from the very beginning is we don't have solutions for all the challenges. We don't even know what all the challenges are. We are a five of so-called experts that we do our best to try to interpret reality, try to find solutions that can work, but we actually don't have any silver bullet, and we will not make anything, let's say, situations that are historically bad, where there are legacies that are of really awful nature, let's say, like racism, for example, to change overnight. So we will do our best effort to understand and to listen and to capture the different perspectives and try to look into the future of what can we do. We have here two simultaneous narratives out of the stock-taking exercise. One, a half-full glass narrative, which is mostly the one of governments. And if you follow the Human Rights Council interactive dialogue of Monday and Tuesday, it was pretty much everything positive. And we had almost all governments of the world in one way or another, in coalitions or individually, saying that they are in favor of the guiding principles, that they like them, and that we should pursue this agenda forward with very little self-criticism, if any. So that's one part. Business in general, again, a positive narrative. We are making progress, we are embedding the guiding principles, we are conducting due diligence, we are understanding our impacts, we are shifting our policies, etc. And and we know, of course, that that is a half-full narrative, half-full glass narrative that falls very short from reality, but nevertheless is let's say, a perception from big business, industry associations, and government that has a positive twist, that is a positive narrative that we are making to a certain extent progress, and that we have more to be done into the future in a direction and a course that is somehow moving in the right direction. That's where we are regarding those two, let's say, broadly speaking, constituencies. But then we have a parallel narrative, which is civil society overall, indigenous people, unions, that is more of a half-empty glass narrative. And of course, it's based on the practical experience of imbalance of power, weak implementation, high level of corruption, corporate capture of the state, disconnection between policies and practices, disconnection between headquarter and subsidiary, weak implementation on the ground, indicators that very often don't exist, and the practical experience of people like you or many of you that have suffered firsthand the consequences of negative impacts or weak governance or governance failures. So we understand that, we listen to that, and we of course have observed that. Actually, with my good friend Pavel, we have traveled together to Brazil and Mexico to conduct country visits, and we saw firsthand what happens to people on the ground, and especially indigenous people that even in some countries are not legally recognized even. So of course, the, let's say, absence of rights for rights holders is total, since many of you don't even exist legally. So therefore we have, of course, let's say, a picture of this half empty, half full. And we need to combine them. So if you look at our report, which has a short version, what we try to do is capture these two perspectives, but have one positive twist that comes from our working group, which is, it is the same glass. It is the same glass that has the potential to be transformative. That's what we aim to, and it's foundational. So we have a common framework, we have common language, we have common principles. And we see with good eyes how we have been moving from almost exclusive soft law approach to a smart mix towards hard law. And we like that approach, how it's evolving in a direction of hardening hard law. And we see a carrot or stick, let's say, picture, and we would like to see the stick working, and we would like to see the carrots growing in size, because a big carrot is almost like a stick. Even if it's not, let's say, integrated into law. And what we also recognize is that just law, it will not be enough in context of weak governance, in context of corruption, in context of corporate capture of the state. Therefore, we need a combination of measures that can take into account this reality, which is a mixed reality, but in where we want, and I think we can, move into a better situation into the future. We will be working the next 4 months, and starting today, actually, that was the number 1 day until the 31st of October, in the roadmap. And we will need your help. Of course, the report, we have it already. You make very specific recommendations that we would like to completely and fully take on board. The right to self-determination, check. Let's say I buy it completely. That is very reasonable thing to aspire to ask. Participation, consultation, and consent. Again, we agree with that, and is the basis for legitimacy for any kind of business operation. Without consent, is the end, because you will be litigating around the corner. It will lack legitimacy, and therefore is a project that shouldn't even fly, or an investment that shouldn't even fly without consent. The right to effective remedy and redress, agree completely, which is nothing from another world. It's an expectation that is absolutely reasonable. And then where I have a little bit of an issue with the language that your colleagues have written is moving beyond the GPs, making it legally binding. And the GPs from the very beginning talk about a smart mix. It's true that at the beginning it was almost exclusively soft law, but we're moving into a harder law arena. And therefore, my suggestion only, because of course it's your report, is to modify a little bit that piece of the narrative to say, because it can be interpreted as leaving behind the guiding principles. And I will advocate to actually keep pushing the guiding principles, as they are the basis for more robust public policy looking into the future, including the element of hard law, which we fully support in this logic of smart mix with companion policies that can actually incentivize in those jurisdictions where rule of law is weak and where governance is weak, to actually get on board this respect for human rights and the indigenous people in particular. So the last observation, we know there is power imbalance. We know that there is legacy, which is awful, and in all parts, many parts of the world, almost all parts of the world, certainly my part of the world and my own country. And very often we are blind. People that are in positions of power or authority, like is my case right now, very often we're ignorant. We just don't get it, not because I don't want to. And actually, my friend Pavel has been my guide in catching up in terms of indigenous people's rights and history, legacy, and the way forward, because very often we're simply ignorant and don't know how to move forward. So I look forward for this conversation. We'll remain in the full session. We'll be paying attention to you and invite you to participate actively in the process towards the roadmap. And the roadmap will be showcased in our 10th annual Forum of Business and Human Rights in Geneva. And this will be the final work that I do for the working group. Since the 31st of October, I'll step down from the working group and will not be part of it any longer. But that will be, let's say, my last contribution is this wrap up of the roadmap and be able to present it with your help. So thanks again very much. My pleasure. And I will remain here all ears and eyes. for the rest of this event. And of course, you know where to find me in our secretariat as well, and how to move forward into the next steps that I just signaled to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for these encouraging opening remarks, and also for your analysis and acknowledgement of the challenges. We shall also try to recognize that the glass is also half full to some extent. And thank you for your commitment to take on our recommendations and keep us on board for the design of the roadmap. We will, of course, take your suggestions into considerations as well. Now, let me turn to the next part of our session, where we will get an overview of the main findings of the publication we are launching today by the authors, Jose Alvin and Johannes Rohr. Jose Alvin is a human rights lawyer from the University of Chile in Santiago and has a Master of Law from the University of British Columbia. Jose has researched and published on human rights, ethnic and cultural diversity, environmental rights, as well as on business and human rights with different organizations, including IVGIA. He teaches Indigenous people's rights at the School of Law in Chile and currently acts as a coordinator for the Globalization and Human Rights Program of the Citizens Watch, a Chilean human rights NGO. And Johannes Rohr, the other author, is a German historian and human rights defender who has been working with indigenous peoples, in particular in Russia, since the mid-90s. For several years, he has worked as IVGIA's Russia coordinator. And after Pavel Zulyanziga, whom we will hear from later, got appointed to the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights in 2012, Johannes has been supporting Pavel's work on the UN Guiding Principles throughout his tenure. But after speaking out at the 2019 UN Forum on Business and Human Rights in Geneva on the situation of indigenous peoples in areas of oil and gas extraction in the Russian Arctic, he was banned from Russia for an unprecedented 50 years. So Johannes, I turn to you now to give us a short background for the report.
And again, this issue with unmuting yourself is, you should get used to it by now, but I'm still having those glitches. Yeah, I guess I won't have to say that much on the background. I mean, it is indeed, I think one of the backgrounds for me was that maybe the glass isn't half full, but I was surprised to see that it's not totally empty. So that was, I guess, one of the big takeaways from the reporting process from me, and this was to some extent encouraging. And I guess I won't have to say very much on the backgrounds of the guiding principles, because I mean, of the very good overview Dante gave now. But of course, we shouldn't forget that the guiding principles are only the latest attempt to impose regulations, or to somehow frame the human rights obligations or responsibilities, or however you want to call them, of non-state actors, of business enterprises, who in many countries wield more economic and even political power than the governments do. And this has actually been going on for half a century. So these attempts to develop and impose regulations and attempts to impose binding regulations have unfortunately all but failed until now. I mean, the last, I guess, well-known attempt was the so-called draft norms, which were turned down by the Human Rights Commission in 2003, after which the guiding principles were developed. And I mean, I think the interesting thing about the guiding principles, apart from that they are non-binding, is that they really try to marry the human rights language and the business language with this concept of human rights due diligence, because the concept of due diligence, of course, was well known and very familiar to any manager, but the concept of human rights due diligence was an innovation trying to transport human rights concepts into business concepts. Yeah, of course, since they are non-binding, the guiding principles were met by indigenous peoples with a whole lot of skepticism, and there wasn't really a huge expectation towards them in the very beginning. And still we found that there has been a dynamic emerging in recent years at various fronts, mostly at policy levels, but still I think something noticeable has been going on, and so it has been quite worthwhile to take stock and to do that at any level, both at the policy level, but also to look at what has actually been, has anything changed on the ground for the better, for the worse? Yeah. And yeah, that's basically, I mean, so our purpose was not so much in, yeah, less in recommendations, but really in assessing what has happened in the meantime. And I hope that this report, to some extent, has lived up to its purpose. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thank you for that, Johannes. And building on to that, I would like to ask Jose, after 10 years of implementation, what progress have you identified with regards to the implementation of the UN Guiding Principles?
Bueno, antes que nada, buenos días.
Yeah, thank you for that. It does indeed seem that the glass is not completely empty. But maybe, Johannes, you could share a few of the key gaps and challenges that were identified when working on the report.
Yeah, and not unexpectedly, I mean, the overarching substantial gap that we found in many places is, of course, that there's a huge gap between the policy level and practice on the ground. So that's a very general remark, which is probably applicable like almost everywhere, with very few exceptions. And also, I mean, this is also old news that indigenous peoples remain disproportionately affected by extractive industries and the like, and also by hydropower and many other extractive activities, which includes some relatively new drivers, such as unfortunately also the emergence of the green economy is not without problems, also because electromobility also drives certain types of mining, which may have if conducted without due respect of indigenous rights, very negative impacts. And we do see, I mean, this is not something we have found out, it's more something what IPRI has been working on, Indigenous Peoples' Rights International, the growing tendency of both criminalization of indigenous human rights defenders, including, of course, killings, unfortunately, many of them in Central America. But also in places where people are not being killed, spaces for civil society may also be shrinking in authoritarian countries such as Russia, where you're not getting shot, but the spaces for civil society are still rapidly shrinking, so that many human rights defenders have left the country. And then there's there's a big disillusionment often about the practice of FPIC and consultation. As I guess most of us know, most Latin American countries have signed on to the ILO Convention 169, which obliges them to respect the right of indigenous peoples to free, prior, and informed consent. And some of them have actually passed consultation laws, but most of those, or usually those consultation laws, are very limited. And the practice of free, prior, and informed consent, as it is directed either by governments or by companies, tries to reduce it to a mere compliance mechanism, to a mere box ticking exercise, and tries to decouple it from the right to self-determination of indigenous peoples. And then there are many other gaps, but maybe one final that I would like to highlight is the continuing issue of international investment agreements, of secret courts, which have no cause of appeal, which undermine national legislation, including national ecological and human rights legislation. And for more gaps, you really have to read the report.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, we don't have so much time to bring out all these great things from the report, but Jose, maybe you could briefly highlight some of the key conclusions of the report.
Bueno, es la misma línea que señalaba Johannes.
Right, thank you so much, Jose. Finally, Johannes, very short, could you give us an overview of the key recommendations included in the report?
Yeah, I've really wondered how short I can actually be, because there's really, I mean, this recommendations part is quite detailed. So maybe just to pick out a few is, I mean, the keyword FPIC has been mentioned several times now, but I think what hasn't been mentioned, I've been following the translation, so I don't know if I missed something, was that states have to ensure not only that they respect the right to FPIC, but practically this means that they have to acknowledge and follow indigenous people's own FPIC protocols or autonomous FPIC protocols, as we have observed that they really have the potential to substantially affect the situation on the ground and to substantially contribute to better respect and protection of indigenous people's rights. So that would be absolutely key moment for us, I think. A second issue, which I think also regards most states, is that while there has been the working group has put a strong emphasis on the potential of national action plans as a means to implement the guiding principles locally. Most national action plans, with one exception, have not had proper consultations with indigenous peoples. I think there's one example in Peru currently where the government has had some degree of consultation, although this has also been far from perfect. So this would be another, I mean, that would actually be both in the same direction, that the right to consultation and consent really has to be respected and fulfilled at all levels. Maybe since we have very little time, I think this combating killings and violence is also a very important recommendation which we have. And for international organizations, I think I would like to just mention one, which is that the open-ended working group, which is currently developing the binding treaty on business and human rights, really has to take care that that indigenous people's rights are not overlooked in this process and in the development of the binding instrument. And yeah, what regards corporations, we also put at the very first place the need to respect indigenous people's right to free, prior, informed consent, and to respect and follow the FPIC protocols that indigenous peoples have themselves developed in order to ensure that FPIC isn't just a word or not just a fancy abbreviation, but really a practice of mutual trust and long-term relationship. And yeah, finally, to indigenous peoples themselves, I mean, again, we have plenty of recommendations, but I just would highlight again, I think the same issue of FPIC, that indigenous peoples should really look at the examples of successfully developed and implemented FPIC protocols, which exist mostly in Latin America, but also in other parts of the world, and try to strengthen their institutions and try to further develop their own FPIC protocols, maybe with the help of allies, because we really saw that this is a very promising instrument. And also, what I think really needs to happen is that indigenous peoples really get more present and more involved in the process around the development of the binding treaty, which I guess will continue for many more years. I mean, it's probably going to take at least as long as the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples took, so like a quarter of a century. So it really takes it's really something that where you can't expect immediate results, but I think it's very important to stay involved there. Yeah, and maybe with that, this very incomplete list, because there are many more recommendations in the report, I would just finish and hand back the floor.
Thank you, Johannes. I think you did manage to touch on some very important recommendations, and I do encourage everyone to really look into the report itself for the full list. But thank you both for giving us this overview of the findings of the report and the recommendations. And next, I'm excited that we will be getting some inputs from our Indigenous representatives from the different regions. And we will start in Latin America, where I'm pleased to introduce our first panelist, Luis Vitor, who for many years has offered support and assistance to community leaders, organizations, and networks of Indigenous peoples in Peru, and also in the broader Andean region of South America, and more recently on the regional level in Latin America. Currently, he is an advisor to the coordinators and board of directors of the FIAI, a network of organizations and networks of Indigenous peoples in Latin America. So, Vitor, could you, from a regional perspective, give us your assessment on what has happened in relation to the implementation of the UN Guiding Principles and the protection of Indigenous peoples' rights?
Muchísimas gracias. Buenos días desde.
Thank you so much, Luis, for this assessment from the Latin American region. Clearly, a lot has been done by many different actors, but there is still a huge gap to ensure the rights of Indigenous peoples to be respected in any business and company ventures. So let's move on to the next region. Let's turn to Africa, where I'm pleased to introduce our next panelist, Mali Ole Kaunga, who is a Laikipia Maasai and the founder and director of an organization called Impact, Indigenous Movement for Peace Advancement and Conflict Transformation. The organization exists to organize, build, and strengthen Indigenous peoples' social movements at the grassroots in northern Kenya. Impact's focus areas include what they call Indigenous peoples' 5 Rs: rights, resources, recognition, respect, and representation in relation to securing land and natural resource rights, policy dialogue, promoting broad legal and human rights, promoting responsible investments, and strengthening Indigenous peoples' responses to climate risks and injustices, and strengthening Indigenous peoples' movements. Ole Kaunga is a global Indigenous leader and activist. So we are looking forward to give to your regional assessment on the implementation of the UN Guiding Principles and protection of Indigenous peoples' rights in Africa. Over to you, Mali Ole Kaunga.
Thank you, everyone, and I'm pleased to be here to share my regional experiences with regard to the implementation of the United Nations Guiding Principles. Yeah, I think it has been very slow for Africa in terms of traction, in terms of implementation of the Guiding Principles, but there are a number of progress in relation to states. I think a number of governments are struggling with the question of improving their policies and laws, and others have made some attempts to come up with the national action plans. And I think Kenya could be one of them that has a national action plan on business and human rights. From the African Commission and human rights, we've seen a number of country visits that have really engaged, raised the profile of the issues at the country level, but also at the Commission level. So we see that as a space, an opening space that Indigenous people have been able to engage on, but also government have been able to begin some country initiatives in terms of progress. We've also seen a growth in terms of a number of, we see of late that there have been a tremendous level of research from universities and a number of other research institutions specifically focusing on the impacts of extractive industries and other businesses on indigenous people. We should aim to generate and inform about the impacts of these businesses. We also have seen cutting across a number of investors or a number of businesses with an attempt to come up with their own kind of guidelines or kind of grievance mechanisms. Not to say that they are effective, but we see a positive where we see government, companies coming up with our grievance mechanisms. On the other, within that same strand, we also see a growing the increase of public-private kind of partnerships, where government enters into partnerships with other or even government themselves because of the increase and because of the demand of resources for industries. We see a increasing number of investments and also towards the direction of extractives. And on the other hand, for us, across and specifically for indigenous people, we've seen the rise of corporate activism, where corporates are using different forms of platforms to really inform the global public, the regional public, and how good their approaches are through either media, through this kind of sponsorship of corporate social responsibilities, but as a way, an attempt to overshadow the negative image of where investments on businesses have really gained over the last couple of years. So for Africa, that is the kind of continue to grow with respect to demands by communities and other. But we also see a lot of land-based investments that impacts and push people to the edge of survival, because much of the investment coming is either targeting land. So we see the gains that the Paris Agreement, the gains that are being attempted for the climate change are being minimized, reduced from the other aspect of the climate and of business and human rights issues. So you realize that, for instance, for a good example will be, you will see this logging going on, for instance, in DRC Congo, while the world is trying to increase the whole question about increasing forest cover. So we see some of the competing interests, even some of the competing uncoordinated efforts within the UN system, but also from within the business. What is then? There are a number of critical issues that remain. The increase of criminalization of indigenous people life, the increase of killings, especially around the Congo Basin, in relation to logging or conservation. We see increase in human rights abuses. We see increase in a number positively, we see a number of communities, a number of indigenous people organizing themselves and utilize free, prior, informed consent. So one of the positive impact of the United Nations Guiding Principles has actually it has raised a question about free, informed consent, and communities are really trying to engage it. They are trying to use it to defend themselves, to defend their territories. But the other thing also, with the increase of organization trying to raise their grievance mechanism, the voluntary guidelines has not worked. And it is not anticipated that it will work, because it's a kind of we are expecting companies to revary themselves. So we don't see really much in terms of positivity of that. The other issue that you can see across the region is this increasing indigenous peoples organizing to raise their voice globally, regionally, and to link this issue to other global indigenous movements. And this is actually one way of building solidarity with them. And for sure, one thing that remains is that indigenous territories are still continuing to evade. And the bigger question is, how do we really make the voluntary guidelines really work? Because there's no any legal backing within the countries where it's in practice. And also for countries like Kenya that have their national action plan on business and human rights in place, it's still another, it's a good thing to have it. It's a good thing to have it, but is it not just a public relations, especially using that they are not really government driven? We know that some of these documents, some of these processes are being funded from outside. There are no, we also see institutions like national human rights institutions, like Kenya National Commission on Human Rights or South African Human Rights Commission. These are publicly funded entities. But if you look at it, the amount of resources being put there from the parliament, they have minimal resources. They have to be funded externally because there's a way, there's an element of kind of a toggle because they're independent commissions. So they really do not have that capacity. So they have to raise resources externally. So are they really independent commissions? If they cannot get adequate budgets from their own government to be able to articulate, and they are the only in Africa, they are the only kind of avenues for communities, for indigenous people specifically, to drive their complaints. If you look at the amount of cases, the amount of cases being handled by the Kenya National Commission, for instance, they are very high, and I think that's another. On a positive note, I think the United Nations guiding principles also created a number of international kind of, there's a recent case in which a community sued one of the multinationals back in London, and they won the case. So I think there are a number of positive, there are a number of other positive developments by communities knowing that they can actually articulate their issues. So for Africa, those are some of the issues, but I think there are some of the recommendations that we bring forward will be actually to ensure that to find a mechanism of making the voluntary guidance to hold companies responsible, because it will take time for the treaty to come to play. So thank you so much for that, for the time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mali Olekaunga. It's clearly that there are still very serious human rights violations going on, and a lot of efforts also to use the UN guiding principles to counter these. Let's see if the situation is different in Asia, where I'm pleased to introduce Guangchun Liu Gangmei, who is a Naga indigenous woman. Guangchun works with the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact as a program coordinator for the Human Rights Campaign and Policy Advocacy Program. Her interests lie primarily on the subjects of indigeneity, indigenous peoples movements, indigenous data sovereignty, land rights, and indigenous human rights defenders. Guangchun, we are looking forward to your assessment from Asia. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Sini. I'll attempt to give an overview of what is happening in Asia, and my counterparts from Asia can also fill in later. So yes, the UN guiding principles provide us with authoritative framework and key tools for states and business to protect, respect human rights and access to remedy for victims. If you look at in Asia on the dissemination and implementation of UN guiding principles, we lag behind as compared to other parts of the world. But some progress have been made to implement the UNGPs in the recent past. If you look at it, Thailand and Japan have adopted standalone national action plans on business and human rights, while India, Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, Pakistan, and Mongolia are in the process of developing a national action plan. South Korea has inserted a chapter on business and human rights in its human rights action plan, and various other states in the region have introduced guidance, policies, and legislations to promote business respect for human rights. India also released national guidelines for responsible business conduct in early 2019. The governments of Nepal and Maldives are considering including sections on business and human rights in the national action plans on human rights. Non-state initiatives to promote the implementation of the UNGPs, including by the private sector, are underway in several states, including Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. Although there has been significant debate about the values of NAPs as a means of promoting business and human rights process, but they have been providing important focal points for promotion of the agenda, though not enough. In some cases, we also see increasing awareness among businesses of the responsibility to respect human rights. But of course, if we look at it closely, we have seen that both states and business critical implementation gaps remain, and the participation of IPs in these processes are never substantive or non-existent, as is evident from the reports that our counterparts have been providing from Thailand on the process of the adoption of national action plans. And at the later part where they adopted, the recommendations from the IPs were not included in the national action plan. So as it's also pointed out in this report, there is a vast gap between policies and declarations on one hand, and the practice on the ground on the other. In many countries and sectors in the region, the influence of international human rights norms is constrained by powerful linkages between states and business interests, as have also raised by other panelists here. And the transnational business activity remains an important driver of economic growth and development in Asia. While offering some parts of population new economic opportunities, pathways out of poverty, significant human rights challenges in business operations continue, with continuing barriers to access to effective remedies. When we look at the context of the indigenous peoples vis-a-vis business, the indigenous peoples of Asia are high up on the list of targets and victims of human rights violations. The trend of indigenous peoples' rights violations is expected to worsen as the government continues to centralize and consolidate its powers and pursues its neoliberal economic development program. Indigenous peoples occupy lands rich in natural resources, which is already established by other panels as well, that are valuable for business operations. However, their rights, including their lands, territories, and resources, and free prior informed consent are very often not recognized and effectively implemented in business context. This results in profoundly negative human rights impacts, including forced evictions, resettlement, loss of land, resources, and livelihoods of indigenous peoples. When indigenous peoples fight back, they face extreme reprisals and risks such as harassment, attacks, disappearances, violence against women, and killings of indigenous leaders and human rights defenders. Worse, lack of access to remedy or justice for human rights abuses continue as a daunting challenge for the affected indigenous community. The informal trend analysis of human rights violations of indigenous peoples reported in our Indigenous Peoples Human Rights Defenders Network of AIPP, business activities in order of mining, agribusiness, energy projects, real estate tourism causes the most violations of land and resources rights and against indigenous human rights defenders. Environmental conservation undertakings such as national parks and forest climate change solutions and infrastructural developments such as mega dams or other contributions for rights abuses. These activities are usually accompanied by militarization and heavy use of security forces to tackle opposition, which results in more violations. Our database in the EIPP have recorded 354 cases from 2019 to till date, and of this, we have recorded 150 cases from Bangladesh and 100 cases from Philippines, and then followed by India, Nepal, Indonesia, Thailand, Cambodia, Myanmar, and Malaysia. of this, our informal analysis points to the direction of violations in the context of land, territories, and resources that stands maximum at 119 cases recorded during this period. So apart from that, there has been gross violations on and repression on civic spaces, and promote false solutions to deny justice across Asia. And in the COVID-19 context, also we have seen a lot of solutions and detrimental laws and policies being passed. As indicative, in Indonesia, the omnibus laws, and in India, the enactment of amendment of Section 8A of Mines, Minerals and Regulations Act, which weakens the public hearings and consultative processes. This shows that there is extreme gap in implementation on huge challenges that we have ahead of us. So I think there needs to be substantive collaborative processes, network building, socialization, and learning as a means of constructive common knowledge base surrounding business and human rights, and influencing the beliefs and behaviors of business and government actors. So as a recommendation, which was published in one of the AIPP briefing paper last year, and I think it's still relevant, is for the state to pass national laws to implement the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, including introducing binding human rights due diligence legislation to ensure companies conduct independent human rights, social and environmental risk and impact assessment, act on their findings, and commit to transparency with the results, to adopt measures to ensure all, including meaningful consultations using FPIC framework with Indigenous peoples, among other groups whose human rights can be potentially affected, and for the business to recognize and respect the human rights defenders and the collective rights of Indigenous peoples, and act to promote or support Indigenous or community-led development priorities, introduce human rights due diligence policies and procedures, including environmental, social, cultural, and other impact assessment, integrating mandatory requirements at the upper management as well as field levels. The other important, and in this challenging environment also, is to continue progress towards implementation of business and human rights agenda. Also demands a sustained focus on creating and defending political and civic spaces through the pro-rights actors inside and outside of the state can generate substantive pressure for change. Thanks, Ine, over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Guangchun, for sharing your assessment with us. I think it's especially worrying how also the private sector is increasingly militarized in some Asian countries, but a lot of important points raised here. Now we are running behind schedule, so I'm afraid we won't be able to make the question and answer section, but if you have burning questions, we might be able to forward them to the panelists afterwards. We are also very much interested in hearing some perspectives on what is needed to advance the implementation of Indigenous people's rights. How do we go from policy development to implementation on the ground? And to answer this question, or at least to reflect on it, I'm pleased to introduce to you our next speaker, Pavel Sulyanziga, an Indigenous Udege from Russia. And Pavel is the chairperson of the board of the International Development Fund of Indigenous Peoples in Russia. And he's currently a visiting scholar at Dartmouth College in the US. He was also a member of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues and also a member of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. Pavel, we look forward to hear your reflections on how we move on from the policy level to the implementation. Over to you.
Спасибо большое. Во-первых, я хотел
Thank you very much, Pavel, for sharing your thoughts on this rather difficult question and for also coming up with very concrete recommendations. We would also like our last panelist to reflect on this same question, and therefore I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Daly Sambo-Doro, an Indigenous Inuit from Alaska. She is the International Chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, and she has been involved directly in the debates and negotiations of the UN Declaration and the ILO Convention 169 for many, many years. She has also been a chairperson and an expert member of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and is now a chair of the International Law Association Committee on Implementation of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So welcome very much to you, Daly Sambo. The floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much. I'll just share some brief comments. I recognize that the time is short. And building upon what my brother Pavel has indicated, I think first of all that it's important to recognize the challenge of implementation of every instrument, right? It has been some years since the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and many still face the challenge of implementation. And so I want to focus on just a few considerations and possible actions that Indigenous peoples can take in order to trigger implementation. Before doing so, I think it's important to recognize that there are multiple intersecting instruments that need to be taken into account in regard to potential implementation, and to use not only the guiding principles as a tool, but all of the other intersecting instruments. Pavel has just mentioned the World Trade Organization and the various different policy and rules and guidelines that emerge just within that context. And so that helps to suggest the number of intersecting instruments that are useful to Indigenous peoples. If we think about them in the context of the various different venues that Indigenous peoples are trying to influence right now, such as the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Convention on Biological Diversity, you can see that there are elements within each of these more environmentally focused instruments that lend themselves to assisting us in terms of implementation of the guiding principles. I also want to comment that that this activity should take place at all scales, and too often we assess and miss the most important scales at the micro level. And by this, I mean the actions of society at the local level, the regional level, the national level, as well as the international level, or the national action plans, for example, focused on the national or domestic context, when in fact the decision-making that's going to potentially impact Indigenous peoples the most is at the micro level, at the local government level, at the provincial, or in the case of the US, at the state level. So to keep these two items in mind as far as implementation is concerned, they recognizing that there are numerous international instruments that intersect with the guiding principles, and to, again, address these matters at all different scales. I wanted to point out before getting into other specific recommendations, one of the things that has emerged in relation to the Arctic region, which I think is a positive development, but doesn't go far enough, and needs greater greater detail, especially in relation to Indigenous peoples, that though the U.S. has developed a national action plan, one of the things that has emerged in the context originally of the World Economic Forum is the Arctic Investment Protocol. And there are broad principles in this investment protocol. For example, there are only 6 of them. The objective of building a resilient society through economic development, respecting and including Indigenous peoples in the context of economic development, pursuing measures to protect the Arctic environment, also responsible and transparent business methods, consulting and integrating science as well as the use of Indigenous knowledge. And finally, strengthening pan-Arctic collaboration and sharing, or north to north sharing of information. And it may have gaps and lack detail, but I think it's significant that on the regional basis, an effort has been made to try to embrace some of the important driving forces behind economic development, and especially in an area, the Arctic region, which has become so significant in terms of geostrategic and geopolitical considerations. At present, we're under an extraordinary amount of pressure because everyone has their eyes on the Arctic, including the obviously security and defense issues, the non-Arctic state issues. So just quickly turning to some of the considerations to draw attention to the need for implementation, I would suggest that Indigenous peoples on a regional basis or potentially globally take time to do inquiries into exactly from their point of view, or I should say buy-in for themselves, to assess and inquire about the conditions concerning the guiding principles in order to give a full Indigenous lens to the impacts or the potential impacts. They could also initiate at a domestic level national inquiries, similar to, for example, what has been practiced in the context of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and national inquiry that puts together and it could be all Indigenous led, or it could be done in partnership with others. It could be prompted by government, prompted and funded by government would be best, but continue to be Indigenous led, or possibly a process that includes Indigenous peoples and independent review. I know of for a fact the independent review process of the Sardar projects in India. Of course, the World Bank is probably less inclined to assist in any way, but it is an example of how to do an assessment or an inquiry. Also, of course, for Indigenous peoples at a host of different scales or levels is continuing the negotiation and dialogue specifically over the guiding principles. How to weave it into possible legislation, national or federal legislation, and looking at the existing policies and how to enhance existing policies and broaden their scope to include the guiding principles, or to pursue activities based specifically on the guiding principles in terms of national legislation. Obviously, the volume has looked at judicial mechanisms, litigation and judicial mechanisms at the international as well as the national level could be undertaken as well. Sometimes these are not the most expedient ways to gain results in implementation, but nevertheless, We have extraordinary tools in the form of the UN Declaration, the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and ILO Convention number 169. When you marry this with the fact that, according to the International Law Association, one of the important general principles, as well as customary international law principles in favor of Indigenous peoples, is their right to redress, reparations, and recourse. And obviously the human rights treaty bodies and depending upon the government of the day and its orientation and ideology, the possibilities for policy through executive order or indeed constitutional reform, which would create an openness, at least a political and legal space for inclusion of important elements of the guiding principles to ensure that Indigenous peoples are front and center in terms of these activities. This all sounds easy to say, but obviously all of these matters are really difficult to do. But the final comment I would make is that any approaches would require a multi-pronged approach and include many different actors, but obviously substantial resources and tools to organize peoples to sustain such important implementation enterprises. So with those words, thank you so much for the opportunity to contribute at least some few perspectives.
Thank you so much, Daily Sambo, for your really good recommendations and suggestions, and also for bringing in some at least partially positive developments also from the Arctic region to inspire us all. Thank you for bringing out these very concrete suggestions to all of us to continue working on. I'm really sorry that we are out of time, so I hope interpreters will stay on for another 10 minutes to allow our two final speakers to give their final remarks. So I'm very honored to introduce the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples to give some closing remarks. Francisco Cali, please, the floor is yours.
Estimados amigos del grupo de trabajo.
Thank you so much, and I apologize. There was some technical glitches with the interpretation, but yeah, thank you very much for those closing remarks. Finally, I would like to give the word to Joanne Carling, the Director of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights International and co-convener of the Indigenous Peoples Major Group for Sustainable Development. Joanne, the floor is yours. You need to unmute.
Yeah, sorry, thanks. Yeah, let me first acknowledge that the initiative of IFGIA in undertaking the report, which is really important in drawing attention in relation to the implementation of the UN guiding principles to Indigenous peoples. Because of the lack of time, I would just like to emphasize some key recommendations from this. One is the need to strengthen the implementation of the human rights due diligence, particularly in relation to the respect of Indigenous peoples' rights, the collective rights of Indigenous peoples, particularly the three interlocking rights: the right to land, territories, and resources, the right to cultural heritage, and the right to self-determination. This has to be fully recognized by states as the framework for the due diligence in the conduct of free, prior, and informed consent. Because there is now a trend that FPIC is a procedural matter, not a substantive expression of our collective rights to lands, territories, and resources. And that's, for example, what's happening in Latin America in relation to the right to consultation is actually an attempt to undermine and just reduce our right to consultation, not because we have, that it's underpinned by our rights to our lands, territories, and resources, which is the one that is at the core of business interest. And we need to hammer that point, because it may end up that the human rights due diligence that includes FPIC is merely a procedural matter, and that the consent is not really based on the protection of our rights to our lands, territories, and resources. So that's one. The second one is the urgent need to establish redress mechanisms at the project level and at the national level. And for this to be effective, there should be resources allocated to indigenous peoples to be able to access, make use of these redress mechanisms. For example, communities cannot even speak the language. So how can they make use of the national court system when they cannot even speak the language? So there is a need to provide support and resources for this. And then the third one is the adoption of course, a binding treaty. And of course, the EU, the EU regulation for corporations, because a binding treaty will set the certainty on the accountability of companies and states when they violate rights. So now with those, I think internally what have been mentioned is, one, we need to do more outreach to indigenous communities because they're not aware. One, they're not even aware of their rights. Second is on the UNGP. In all my visits to, because I've been working on business and human rights for so long, and the common thing that states and companies say to communities is, when they take over in communities' lands and resources, they would say, you better accept our compensation offer because you don't have legal title to your lands. You're better off to receive, because we will evict you anyway. That should change. That should change, and that is still the prevailing notion, no? So what we need to, and communities, because they're not aware of their rights, they will just give in, right? So in that sense, we need to do more outreach, especially to communities that are targeted by business in terms of their resources, and do capacity building as well, especially like mentioned already, the FPIC, that communities develop their own protocol. That is the way we assert our rights to our lands, territories, and resources, our right to self-determination. That's the way we should carry it forward. So part of the capacity building is really the development of community protocols, of which that will be the tool for communities to advance their rights. And I fully support the suggestion of Daly in terms of the use of different intersecting human rights instruments and tools. And this is exactly what we need to push. We need to be submitting all cases to the Committee on Economic and Social Cultural Rights, for examples, highlighting all the violations when we prepare for the UPR, the abuse of women when using CEDAW, the abuse of children, all of this. We need to, so that the whole UN system is flooded by the need to address this issue and that impunity exists. So that is one. And second is the of course the collaboration with others, especially with our allies, in making use of these mechanisms, right? Because it also requires resources when we use these mechanisms. So we need to be able to generate both financial and other forms of expertise and resources needed so that we can use these existing instruments. And finally, just to say this to Dante, that we need to collaborate with the working group. especially in developing the roadmap. So just to flag, Dante, we will get back to you to schedule series of consultations on the roadmap for that we also want to develop, because it would be good for us as Indigenous peoples to also have our own roadmap on how do we demand accountability to those that has to be account. How do we assert, how do we make use of all the mechanisms that are available? How do we do outreach? How do we do building alliances and networks with others? And of course, we need to collaborate as well with our special rapporteur, Francisco Cali. He's playing an important role in raising the continuing violation of Indigenous peoples by business operations. And perhaps we can come up with like studies, continue to do studies or thematic reports. And also the suggestion a while ago of Dali in terms of doing inquiries. It can be national, but it can also be industry-wide, like inquiry in relation to extractive industries, inquiry in relation to renewable energy that are violating Indigenous people's rights, or inquiry on the abuse of women by business. So there are different layers where we can really target different actors so that we raise more attention to how the UNGP should be implemented in the context of Indigenous peoples. So sorry for taking time, but thank you. Thank you for IFGIA. That's on behalf of IPRI, and thank you also to Dante, to Francisco, and all the other speakers. Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much, Joanne. And I'm really sorry to have to cut you short, but I need to let the interpreters go. Thank you so much for all the panelists and speakers and organizers and participants. I think we had some very rich elaborations to the report, and I really encourage everyone to download the report and to read it. And yeah, so thank you so much. I don't know, Dante, do you want the last word? I see your hand is raised.
Thank you. And sorry, just to say that I encourage you to participate in the process that we have opened now for the roadmap finalization, because you have already contributed to the roadmap, but it's not fully done. And now you have an opportunity to make sure that your points of view are sufficiently well captured. That's one thing. The other thing is that we are discussing with the European Union. They want to push for a global playing field on business and human rights, not only a European level playing field on business and human rights, which is already a political agreement within the EU, but actually a global one. Third point is that we are having discussions with Japan and the United States regarding business and human rights as well, to make them part of a coalition that goes beyond the European Union, and we are doing active fundraising with the aim to create a global fund, a global trust fund for capacity building, with the contribution of a coalition of donors. And that's why we are engaging with Japan, for example, because we absolutely get it that their capacity is not just invite to a workshop, but actually provide the means, and the means for all players to be managed and used by themselves, not by a third-party consultant, despite the good intentions. And that is something that it's on its way, crossing fingers. And we have had in this week 3 meetings with the High Commissioner herself in order to make sure that we are on the same page when we look into the next decade of implementation with much higher ambition that requires a much bigger investment of resources, not only of good intentions. And so I can't guarantee that this is going to work, but at least we are pushing in the right direction and pushing the right buttons. And so far we are in good track. So thanks again for the invitation. Don't, let's say, miss the opportunity to contribute. Invite us to your consultations and dialogues. Happy to participate in any format. If we need to co-convene something, very happy to put our branding there, because we need your perspective and we need your points of view and suggestions. And hopefully we'll be able to capture your expectations, hopefully fully, but at least to a large extent. So that's what I wanted to share with you, more or less a good news in terms of perspective. Thank you.
Thank you so much for stretching out your hand. We will definitely grab it and continue collaboration. So thank you once again, everyone, and have a good day or good evening or good night to everyone. Thank you for your participation.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Good to see all of you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Nice to see you, all of you.
See you daily.
Yeah.
Hasta luego.
Ciao.